What happens when entire mountains are carved downward into temples without a single misplaced cut? Or when cave walls painted in near darkness still hold colours that refuse to fade? How did architects shape stone wheels the size of rooms, raise towers that balance on perfect ratios, or align whole cities to landscapes of boulders and rivers? And why do so many of these places, Kailasa, Ajanta, Konark, Hampi, Khajuraho and more, carry signs of unfinished work, shifting plans or stories lost to time? In this journey through India's ancient megastructures, we'll explore what the stones reveal, what they withhold, and why their mysteries remain quietly unresolved. Kailasa Temple. Carved into the volcanic flank of the Deccan Plateau, the Kailasa Temple emerges as a structure that seems at first almost straightforward in its intent, a monumental shrine dedicated to Shiva, shaped from the living basalt of Ellora's cliff. But the longer its surfaces are studied, the more its presence feels like an unanswered question about choices made in stone more than a millennium ago. Choices that suggest not a single moment of construction, but a sustained vision carried through layers of excavation that moved downward instead of upward, as though the builders reversed the typical logic of temple architecture and committed to a method that demanded foreknowledge of every final contour before the first strike of a chisel was made. And this unusual approach becomes the quiet doorway into its mystery. For while inscriptions and dynastic records attribute its creation to the Rashtrakutas, they reveal little about the practical sequence that could remove hundreds of thousands of tons of rock, while preserving delicate columns, friezes, and interior volumes without error. And so the visitor stands before a courtyard that feels less constructed than revealed, its colonnades chiselled from the same material as the floor beneath them, its towering vimana rising from bedrock rather than assembled block by block. An integrity of mass that hints at a calculation of voids and solids that would have required a sophisticated understanding of how light would later travel across the surfaces, how rainwater would move along hidden channels, and how the weight of the uppermost carvings would settle on the strata below. And yet, the archaeological evidence remains fragmentary, offering glimpses of tool marks that suggest teams of artisans working simultaneously on multiple levels, perhaps guided by plaster models or sectional plans that have not survived, though no contemporary treatise describes such methods. And within this absence of textual guidance, questions gather at the margins of the basalt walls, not implying impossibility, but rather inviting curiosity about the ancient logistics of quarrying, labour distribution, and the techniques used to maintain vertical precision in a negative space excavation where a single miscalculation could compromise an entire facade. While still observable are the alternating sequences of rough and polished surfaces, indicators of stages in the work where priorities shifted, perhaps responding to political pressures or changes in artistic leadership. And along the periphery of the courtyard stand subsidiary shrines and sculptural panels whose iconographic programs appear unified in theme yet varied in style, suggesting phases of production that may have spanned generations rather than a single reign. And as researchers compare it to other monolithic structures in India, they note similarities in approach, but rarely in scale. For Kailasa remains exceptional in the sheer ambition of turning a mountain into a freestanding complex with multi-storied colonnades and intricately carved reliefs that depict mythological scenes, with a confidence in three-dimensional planning that seems to anticipate the viewer's movement from one chamber to another. And yet, even as scholars map these spatial rhythms, they encounter questions about why certain surfaces remain unfinished, or why some interior passages appear partially abandoned mid-excavation, their walls bearing the faint parallel lines of early chiselling, but lacking the decorative program seen elsewhere. And these irregularities suggest moments when shifting priorities, resource limitations, or political upheavals altered the course of construction, leaving behind architectural pauses that are as informative as the finished work. And beyond the human narrative, the geology itself contributes to the temple's quiet enigma. For basalt weathers unevenly, its hidden fractures potentially guiding the artisan's decisions. And although the builders understood this material intimately, they left behind no explicit records of how they predicted or managed structural risks, leading modern engineers to speculate about whether a combination of experience, testing, and incremental adaptation formed the guiding principles that allowed such a vast monolith to remain stable for centuries. And all the while, the temple's proportions maintain a deliberate alignment that mirrors traditional Dravidian layouts, even though those layouts were conventionally achieved through additive construction rather than subtractive excavation, creating a conceptual fusion of form and method that feels both familiar and singular, as if the builders drew upon established temple architecture, while simultaneously reimagining it through the logic of sculpting rather than building a synthesis that leaves modern researchers with a sense of intentionality that cannot be fully retraced. For its designers appear to have balanced symbolic geometry, ritual function, and aesthetic ambition in ways that blur the boundaries between planning and adaptation. And this sense of blurred boundaries continues inside the main shrine, where the central linga chamber sits beneath the towering monolithic vimana, a vertical axis carved from the same continuous mass of stone, creating an almost geological continuity between earth and structure, an effect that may have been intentional or simply a byproduct of the chosen method. Yet, either way, it amplifies the impression that Kailasa is not merely a temple carved into rock, but an architectural idea expressed through the mountain itself. And as light and shadow shift across the complex throughout the day, they animate the reliefs in patterns that raise further questions about the builder's awareness of natural illumination, particularly in the recessed and shadowed areas where certain carvings receive direct light only at specific times of year, prompting ongoing studies of whether these alignments were incidental or part of a broader ritual calendar now partially lost. And so the temple stands today as an intersection of evidence and ambiguity, clear in its craftsmanship, but elusive in its full historical context, a structure whose sheer existence shows the remarkable capabilities of the artisans, yet whose method and sequence remain partly speculative. Not because they are inexplicable, but because the surviving record is incomplete, leaving room for hypotheses grounded in technology, workforce organisation, and ancient architectural practices that continue to evolve as new surveys and analyses are conducted. And in this ongoing uncertainty, the site retains a quiet power, a sense of something fully human, yet not fully understood, a reminder that even within the boundaries of known history, there are chapters where intention, labour, and landscape converge in ways that resist complete reconstruction, allowing Kailasa Temple to remain not a mystery of impossibility, but a monument to the complexity of ancient craftsmanship, whose final story still lies somewhere between the carved stone and the silences that surround it. Ajanta Caves. Carved into a sweeping horseshoe of basalt cliffs above the Wagora River, the Ajanta Caves begin as a sequence of dim entrances set into stone, each facade subdued by centuries of weathering, yet the moment one steps into their interiors, real or imagined on the page, the transition from raw rock to deliberate space becomes unmistakable, revealing an unfolding architectural narrative that feels at first serene and monastic, before gradually deepening into something more intricate. For the arrangement of chaitya halls and viharas suggests both spiritual refuge and elaborate planning. Yet the precise order of excavation remains elusive, as though the artisans worked in a shifting rhythm, shaped by patronage, doctrinal needs, and the inherent unpredictability of carving inward from a vertical cliff face without written guidelines to survive them. And so the caves carry this quiet ambiguity in their very sequence, with early Hinayana forms, marked by austere columns and barrel-vaulted ceilings that seem to echo the absent timber constructions they once imitated, while later Mahayana caves burst with elaborately carved pillars, sculptural guardians, and mural-covered walls whose pigments still cling to the stone despite the long centuries of monsoon winds flowing through the ravine. And in the interplay between these periods lies a subtle mystery. Gaps of time that appear in stylistic shifts and unfinished corners, suggesting episodes of abandonment followed by renewed activity, possibly under different dynasties or monastic lineages, none of which left comprehensive records explaining why they returned, or how they reorganized the immense task of excavating, smoothing and painting chambers that required synchronized labor from stonemasons, sculptors, plasterers and painters working in delicate succession. And the murals themselves deepen this sense of layered intention, for they depict episodes from the Jataka tales and scenes of courtly life with a sophistication of line and shading rarely associated with cave interiors. Their fresco-like technique demanding rapid application onto wet surfaces under low-light conditions that modern specialists attempt to reconstruct using oil lamps and reflectors. Yet no study fully resolves how the ancient artisans maintained such precision in spaces where smoke, shadow, and the curvature of walls should have compromised accuracy, and the presence of scaffolding holes carved into the walls provides clues but not full explanations, as their spacing often aligns with sections of narrative panels rather than structural needs, implying a careful choreography of movement within cramped interiors. And throughout the galleries there are faint marks, grids scratched beneath pigment layers, incised outlines beneath finished figures, abandoned sketches on back walls, each one hinting at working methods known in theory but still difficult to visualize at scale, especially when considering that many caves were excavated from the top downward or in multiple directions simultaneously, a technique requiring remarkable foresight to avoid intersecting mistakes. And yet, even this practical ingenuity becomes more complex when set against the acoustic character of the Chaitya halls. For these long nave-like spaces amplify chanting and rhythmic recitation in ways that seem intentional. The vaulted ceilings and ribbed patterns shaped to manipulate resonance, though scholars debate whether the acoustic effect was deliberately engineered or simply a beneficial outcome of forms inherited from earlier wooden prototypes, leaving open questions about how much of Ajanta's architectural identity was purposeful experimentation versus continuity of tradition. And while inscriptions link certain caves to specific donors, merchants, monks, princes, these brief acknowledgements reveal little about the larger administrative structure that must have coordinated decades of excavation, supply transport, and workforce sustenance in a relatively remote setting accessible only through narrow paths above a river that swells dramatically during monsoon months, suggesting that the seasonal rhythms of the landscape influenced work cycles, though archaeological layers show no definitive pattern that fully maps onto the stylistic chronology, creating yet another point where evidence and interpretation diverge. And as researchers analyze pigment composition, they uncover traces of lapis lazuli, ochre, malachite, and organic binders whose origins raise questions about trade routes and artistic exchanges that extended far beyond the Deccan. Threads of cultural connection implied, but not fully documented, while the iconographic programs reveal themes reflecting evolving Buddhist doctrine, bodhisattva imagery swelling in scale, narrative, density increasing, ornamental motifs becoming more elaborate. Yet the reason some caves remain incomplete, with half-formed pillars and rough-hewn sanctuaries, remain a matter of conjecture, possibly tied to shifts in patronage or political changes around the fall of the Vakatakas. And in this mingling of artistry and interruption, Ajanta acquires its quiet, unresolved character. For while its craft is abundantly present, its context is only partially recoverable, leaving the site suspended between what is known, tool marks, pigment layers, architectural plans, and what is inferred through patterns that might represent historical pauses, doctrinal transitions, or the simple challenges of working within unforgiving stone. And the surrounding landscape amplifies this atmosphere, as the river's horseshoe curve seems to cradle the cliff while simultaneously cutting it off, creating natural isolation that must have shaped the monastic experience, yet also raises the question of how such an elaborate cultural project flourished in a location requiring sustained commitment from patrons who left few detailed inscriptions behind. And as one moves through the caves, the interplay of shadow and surviving colour evokes another layer of mystery. Whether the interior lighting was once enhanced by reflective surfaces or lamps arranged with deliberate care, or whether the murals were meant to be viewed only in the soft, flickering light of monastic rituals, a mode of perception now nearly impossible to replicate in modern conditions. And thus, the caves we see today offer both clarity and distortion, their preservation uneven, their surfaces worn, their pigments altered by centuries of climatic fluctuation. Yet, through these changes, the underlying design remains discernible enough to sense a unity of purpose that feels simultaneously comprehensible and distant. And in the end, Ajanta does not present itself as an enigma of impossibility, but rather as a testament to the complexity of ancient artistic systems whose full operational details were never written down, leaving the modern observer with a landscape of evidence, rich enough to inspire confidence in its human creation, yet incomplete enough to leave lingering questions about how such coordination unfolded in practice. And it is within this gap between the material certainty of carved stone and the historical silences that surround it that the site maintains its enduring aura, offering a reminder that the ancient world often balanced practical knowledge, spiritual intention, and artistic ambition in ways that resist complete reconstruction, allowing the Ajanta caves to remain a monument not only of craftsmanship, but of the mysteries carried quietly by places shaped across centuries of changing vision and forgotten labour. Konark Sun Temple. Rising from the coastal plain of Odisha, like the remnant of a long-eroded monument to light and motion, the Konark Sun Temple begins with the familiar outline of a massive chariot drawn by stone wheels and sculpted horses. Yet the moment its surviving structures are examined more closely, the clarity of that metaphor gives way to layers of architectural decisions that feel at once purposeful and only partially understood. For although the 13th century Ganga kings left a clear dedicatory intention to honour Surya, the solar deity, the methods by which they translated that vision into a temple whose very plan seems to move across the earth remain scattered through fragments of collapsed mandapas, weathered reliefs, and an incomplete sanctum that once towered far higher than the plinth that survives today. And in this interplay between ambition and ruin lies the quiet atmosphere that shapes the site. For the temple appears both monumental and interrupted, as though its present form captures only a portion of its original architectural conversation with the shifting coastal landscape, where salt-laden winds, monsoon rains, and the slow retreat of the shoreline have shaped the stone more insistently than many surviving records, leaving archaeologists to work backward from evidence that is as much absence as presence. And standing before the intricately carved wheels, 12 on each side, their spokes and axles rendered with geometric precision, it becomes clear that their consistent proportions are not merely decorative, but reflect an underlying mathematical order, one that lends itself to calendrical interpretations often discussed, but not conclusively proven. For while the alignments of certain shadows and spokes correspond intriguingly to solar cycles, no inscription survives to confirm whether these effects were intentional design features or the natural consequence of a temple devoted to a solar deity built by artisans steeped in traditional astronomical knowledge. And this uncertainty extends to the broader orientation of the structure, which faces east in a manner suited to the rising sun, but whose collapsed tower, if reconstructed as scholars propose, would have cast a vast shadow across the forecourt during specific times of year, prompting ongoing debates about whether ritual performance once interacted with these changing patterns of light. And as attention shifts to the Jagamohana, the assembly hall that still stands, its massive stone beams and corbelled roof present another puzzle, for their survival contrasts sharply with the vanished shikara of the main sanctum, a disappearance historically attributed to the weakness of iron beams, the violence of storms, or the gradual collapse of internal supports, though none of these explanations fully account for the pattern of debris described in early colonial records, which note large quantities of dressed stone blocks strewn across the sand as though the fall occurred in gradual stages rather than a single catastrophic event. And this long, slow disintegration raises questions about how the builders balanced the weight of the superstructure on a plan defined by movement motifs, rolling wheels, sculpted horses, and dynamic friezes that encircle the plinth with scenes of courtly life, musicians, dancers, and celestial figures. Imagery so fluid it seems almost paradoxical against the rigid structural demands of heavy stone construction. And throughout the site, iconographic sequences unfold with a density that reflects both artistic exuberance and encoded cosmology. Yet the reasons for certain placements remain elusive, for while many panels follow conventional patterns of protective deities, mythological episodes, and symbolic motifs, others appear at unexpected heights or orientations, implying that the sculptural program may have evolved in response to changes in patronage or shifts in ritual emphasis, possibilities supported by inscriptions that reference multiple phases of construction, but provide few details about how design decisions were coordinated across such an expansive project. And then there is the long-standing description of an iron or magnetite lodestone once believed to have crowned the temple's main tower, a feature mentioned in later texts and regional lore, but lacking direct archaeological corroboration. Yet the persistence of this idea highlights the site's capacity to generate speculation in the gaps left by missing structural elements. For while magnetic alignment theories stretch beyond the bounds of evidence, the actual use of iron clamps and dowels throughout the surviving architecture is well documented, revealing a sophisticated joinery system that relied on both metal and stone to balance the geometry of heavy loads in a coastal environment where corrosion posed a constant challenge, and the partial survival of these clamps shows how some endured while others failed, offering insights into both the ingenuity of the builders and the vulnerabilities that may have contributed to the temple's gradual ruin. And this theme of vulnerability continues in the relationship between the temple and the encroaching sea. For although the shoreline now lies farther away, historical accounts suggest that shifting sands and coastal erosion once threatened the plinth itself, prompting later restoration efforts that changed the landscape around the temple, and perhaps altered drainage patterns that had originally been engineered to manage monsoon runoff, leaving open questions about how the builders integrated hydrology into their design, an aspect of ancient architecture often overlooked but crucial in a region defined by seasonal extremes. And while the temple's surviving form still conveys the grandeur of its original intent, its missing sections, pillars whose capitals have vanished, staircases leading nowhere, sculpted niches empty of their deities, invite consideration of how the site functioned as a ritual centre at its peak. For pilgrim circulation, ceremonial processions, and the movement of light across reliefs would have shaped the experience of those who entered its precincts. Yet, reconstructing these sensory dimensions remains challenging without more complete evidence. leaving scholars to piece together possibilities from comparative studies of other Ganga-era temples, whose textual and architectural records are more intact. And thus, Konark stands today as a place where certainty and speculation meet in measured tension, its craftsmanship undeniable, yet its full narrative obscured by time, its wheels still precise, yet their intended role only partly deciphered, its collapsed tower hinting at both structural ambition and the consequences of building at monumental scale. And through these intertwined ambiguities, the temple maintains an air of quiet mystery, not because it defies history, but because its surviving fragments speak simultaneously of mastery and incompleteness, inviting interpretations grounded in archaeology, engineering, and historical context, while continuing to withhold a definitive account of how its builders balanced form, symbolism, and structural risk, allowing the Konark Sun Temple to remain a testament to the brilliance of medieval Indian architecture, and to the inherent limits of reconstructing a world whose most eloquent explanations were once held in structures now only partially standing. Mahabalipuram Shore Temples. Set along the wind-shaped coastline of Tamil Nadu, where granite outcrops meet the restless Bay of Bengal, the Mahabalipuram shore temples extend their weathered silhouettes toward the horizon with an austerity that feels both deliberate and eroded, as though the passage of centuries has thinned the line between architecture and landscape, leaving behind a sequence of shrines whose original composition can be glimpsed only through the fragments that remain and the geological clues etched by salt, wind, and storm. Yet despite this surface wear, the underlying plan retains an unmistakable coherence, for the complex attributed to the Pallava kings forms part of a larger layout of rock-cut caves, monolithic rathas, and unfinished sculptures spread across the ancient port town, suggesting a coordinated architectural vision shaped by both religious tradition and the practical demands of carving granite that resists even the most determined tools. And as the main shore temple rises above the shore with its tiered vimanas aligned eastward, the first impression is one of simplicity. Yet a closer look reveals a dense network of sculptures, guarding lions, seated bulls, deities housed within compact sanctums, whose arrangement hints at phases of construction and adaptation. For inscriptions and stylistic details suggest the site underwent multiple expansions and restorations, some driven by changing ritual needs, and others by the relentless sea, which pushed inward throughout the medieval period, submerging portions of the coastline and perhaps swallowing earlier structures. A possibility supported by offshore surveys that have revealed the outlines of dressed stones lying beneath shifting sands, though their interpretation remains cautious, for erosion and natural rock formations complicate definitive conclusions. And this interplay of evidence and ambiguity shapes the broader mystery surrounding the 7 pagodas, described in early travellers' accounts, a term long applied to the shore temples, despite the absence of textual proof for all 7 standing simultaneously. Yet the persistence of this tradition reflects an enduring human instinct to fill gaps in the record, an instinct that archaeologists navigate carefully as they examine submerged formations that could represent collapsed mandipas or isolated boulders weathered into suggestive forms. And while sonar and diving surveys have documented rectilinear blocks that imply deliberate shaping, their context is too incomplete to assemble into a coherent architectural plan, leaving open the question of how many structures once stood along this shifting coastline, and how many were lost to cycles of storm surges, tectonic uplift, and gradual shoreline retreat. And as one moves inland to the cluster of monolithic rathas carved from single granite masses, the technical choices of the Pallava artisans become more apparent. For these chariots display an architectural experimentation that seems to anticipate forms later realized in the structural temples near the water, their varied plans, rectangular, apsidal, tiered or pyramidal, offering a catalogue of Dravidian styles rendered not through assembled masonry, but through subtractive carving, a method that requires a complete mental map of the final form before excavation begins, much as seen at Kailasa, yet at a more intimate scale. And the presence of unfinished rathas suggests either a sudden halt in patronage or a shift in royal priorities, interruptions that echo the partially eroded and incomplete features of the shore temples themselves. And throughout this landscape of carved granite, geological forces weave themselves into the architectural story. For the crystalline structure of the stone fractures under repeated exposure to sea spray and monsoon winds, forming granular surfaces that complicate efforts to determine the original level of sculptural detail. And this natural loss of definition across centuries also raises questions about how the temples once interacted with the elements. For historical accounts mention the gleaming effect of sunlight on their stone surfaces, implying a degree of polish that the present-day weathered forms no longer convey. And this lost sheen deepens the sense of distance between the structures as they stand today and the vibrant, sacred coastal complex they once formed. And the alignment of the shore temples also introduces subtle puzzles, particularly the orientation of the twin shrines, one dedicated to Shiva facing east, the other to Vishnu facing west. An arrangement that creates a symbolic axis running from sunrise to sunset, yet may also reflect broader ritual or maritime functions. For the coastline was historically a node in international trade networks, and some scholars suggest that the temple silhouettes may have served as landmarks for sailors navigating the region's unpredictable currents, though this remains speculative due to scarce textual evidence, leaving the possibility suspended between practical function and symbolic resonance. And within the main temple, the sanctum's interior bears marks of centuries of ritual activity, as well as signs of earlier restoration attempts that replaced worn stones or reinforced weakened corners, revealing a layered history of maintenance seldom recorded in inscriptions, but visible through changes in masonry texture and the varying degrees of precision in sculptural motifs. And these interventions, while necessary for preservation, complicate efforts to disentangle original Pallava craftsmanship from later work, adding another layer of ambiguity to the site's architectural narrative. And as the tide advances and retreats along the shore, exposing temporary pools among the rocks and sending spray against the temple plinth, the dynamic environment underscores how precariously the complex exists between land and sea. A precariousness reflected in local stories of structures lost to storms and legends of submerged cities which, while not supported by direct archaeological proof, speak to the lived experience of a coastline in motion, where memory and erosion intermingle, leaving traces that resist easy interpretation. And thus, the shore temples stand today as both evidence and remainder, shaped by human intention, yet continually altered by coastal forces, their survival a testament to the resilience of granite and the persistence of cultural memory, and their uncertainties, submerged foundations, lost sculptures, unfinished carvings, form a quiet space where historical reconstruction meets the limits of available evidence, inviting interpretations grounded in geology, archaeology, and architectural analysis, while leaving room for the awareness that not every stone tells its full story, allowing Mahabalipuram to retain a presence defined not by impossibility, but by the slow, ongoing dialogue between craftsmanship, landscape, and time, which together preserve its enduring sense of mystery. Brihadiswara Temple. Emerging from the fertile plains of the Kaveri Delta, the Brihadiswara Temple rises with a confidence that seems almost at odds with the subtle complexities woven into its granite mass. For while its towering vimana and grand axial layout immediately evoke the unmistakable authority of the Chola kings, a closer examination reveals patterns of construction, adaptation, and logistical ingenuity that resist simple explanation, not through any suggestion of the extraordinary, but through the sheer intricacy of an architectural endeavour executed at a scale that still challenges modern assumptions about medieval engineering. And as one approaches the temple's monumental gateway, the balance between spacious courtyards and densely carved sanctums begins to unfold, with each element arranged along an east-west axis that suggests both ritual alignment and a sophisticated understanding of how movement through space reinforces the underlying cosmological symbolism. Yet inscriptions that describe aspects of the temple's creation remain selective, offering administrative detail, lists of donations, festivals, and land grants, while remaining silent on the practical methods by which artisans raised a vimana that ascends more than 60 meters above the sanctum. Its granite blocks, fitted with a precision that defies assumptions, not because it is inexplicable, but because the procedures that enabled it were never formally recorded, leaving scholars to interpret the remnants of scaffolding holes, quarry traces, and subtle variations in stone grain as clues to a building process that required coordination across multiple guilds over a relatively short span of years. And in the shadow of this towering structure, the famous monolithic Nandi stands facing the sanctum, its polished surface still bearing the faint marks of abrasion and water interaction that reflect both ritual offerings and environmental exposure, and its scale, one of the largest of its kind, raises questions about how such a massive granite form was transported to its present position, though geological analysis suggests it was carved from a single block quarried within the region, then moved along a prepared route that left no permanent traces due to centuries of agricultural reshaping. And this theme of enigmatic logistics extends to the vimana itself, whose upper courses contain stones weighing several tons, prompting ongoing discussions about the methods used to lift them into place, ranging from inclined earthen ramps extending across the landscape to complex pulley systems supported by temporary wooden frameworks. And while none of these theories can be verified with complete certainty, each remains plausible within the technological and organizational capabilities documented in other Chola-era contexts. And stepping inside the sanctum, the interplay of light, shadow, and echo reveals the deliberate acoustic and spatial design typical of Dravidian temples. Yet, Brihadiswara amplifies this effect through its unusually tall interior chamber, whose verticality may reflect both symbolic aspiration and practical attention to thermodynamics, as the chamber's height facilitates heat dispersion from oil lamps, while also enhancing the resonance of ritual chants, though these aspects are rarely mentioned in inscriptions, and instead must be inferred through architectural analysis, creating another junction where evidence and interpretation intertwine. And throughout the temple complex, sculptural panels illustrate scenes from Shaivite mythology, celestial dancers, and guardian deities, rendered in a style distinct to the Chola aesthetic, with elongated forms and flowing ornamentation that suggest both movement and ritual attire. Yet certain panels appear stylistically transitional or unfinished, indicating that work may have continued even after the temple's formal consecration, a practice supported by historical patterns across South Indian temples, but difficult to confirm explicitly due to the limited survival of workshop records. And this sense of ongoing construction becomes more apparent in the subsidiary shrines, some of which show variations in stone quality and carving refinement that point toward phased additions or repairs over subsequent centuries, further complicating efforts to define a single moment of completion. And as one walks along the cloistered corridors added in later periods, the contrast between Chola granite and the softer stone used in subsequent expansions underscores the long temporal layers that now coexist within the complex. Traces of later dynasties who preserved, adapted, or reinterpreted the temple in ways that both honour and transform its original character. And these overlapping phases raise questions about how much of the structure we, See Today reflects the initial vision of Raja Chola I, and how much represents the accumulated work of artisans responding to evolving ritual needs, political climates, and preservation challenges. And while the temple's scale and precision invite admiration, they also introduce subtler mysteries, particularly in the realm of structural engineering. For the weight distribution within the Vimana appears carefully calculated to avoid lateral stress, yet the exact sequence of construction remains uncertain, especially regarding the placement of keystone-like blocks that anchor the uppermost tiers, and engineers studying the structure debate whether the builders employed internal scaffolding, external ramps, or a combination of both, with each hypothesis supported by comparative evidence from contemporaneous temples, yet lacking definitive archaeological confirmation at Brihadiswara itself. And beneath the temple floor, inscriptions and architectural remains hint at earlier phases of planning, including indications that the temple's dimensions follow specific ratios that align with canonical vastu principles, though scholars disagree on whether these proportions result from strict adherence to treatises or from flexible adaptation of geometric norms by experienced builders, revealing yet another area where ancient practice cannot be fully reconstructed. And the landscape surrounding the temple further contributes to its layered atmosphere, for the Kaveri Delta has shifted subtly over the centuries, altering water flow and soil composition. And while the Cholas engineered canals and reservoirs throughout the region, it remains unclear how these systems interacted with the temple's own drainage network, some of which is visible in surviving stone channels, while other parts are obscured by later constructions and restorations, leaving hydrological aspects of the temple's design partly speculative. And in the end, the Brihadiswara temple stands not as an unsolved puzzle, but as a monument to the sophistication of medieval South Indian craftsmanship, whose surviving inscriptions provide administrative clarity, yet leave open the questions of technique and coordination that modern observers instinctively seek. And it is within this space, between the documented and the deduced, the finished carvings and the unfinished edges, the towering Vimana and the uncertain methods that raised it, that the site maintains its quiet sense of mystery, offering a reminder that the most imposing structures often carry within their stones the traces of decisions, adaptations, and lost knowledge that resist complete reconstruction, ensuring that Brihadiswara continues to evoke wonder, grounded not in improbability, but in the enduring complexity of human ambition shaped through granite and time. Hampi, spread across a landscape of colossal boulders, stepped tanks, and dry-season riverbeds, the ruined city of Hampi stretches with a scale and subtlety that only becomes apparent as one moves between its scattered monuments. For at first glance, the terrain itself seems to dominate, its granite formations rising in irregular clusters that appear almost untouched by human intervention. Yet the closer one looks, the more the city reveals a deliberate conversation between natural geology and architectural intent, as though the planners of the Vijayanagara capital chose not merely to build upon the land, but to incorporate its shapes, contours, and fractures into a unified spatial vision that still holds together despite centuries of abandonment. And it is this interweaving of the built and the natural that forms the initial quiet thread of mystery. Not because the city defies explanation, but because the logic of its planning unfolds across vast distances and multiple layers of purpose, ceremonial, defensive, hydraulic and domestic, without leaving behind detailed textual accounts that describe how these layers were coordinated, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct the city's rhythms from stone alignments, foundation traces, and the seldom explained placement of temples and markets along axes that mirror both political ideology and the constraints of the terrain. And walking through the Virupaksha temple complex, where worship continues even today, one sees hints of the city's enduring spiritual core, Yet this is only the beginning of a network of shrines, whose orientations and scales vary in ways that suggest a planning system, both hierarchical and adaptive, with major temples anchoring routes that once guided festivals and processions, while smaller shrines nestle within rocky outcrops or stand near ancient paths that skirt the Tungabhadra River. A placement pattern that may have followed geomantic principles or practical necessity, though the absence of surviving guidelines leaves these choices open to interpretation, creating a gentle uncertainty that mirrors the uneven survival of the structures themselves. And as one moves toward the great bazaars and pillared mandapas, their lengths stretching across open plains, once bustling with traders, animals and pilgrims, the architectural style reveals a clarity of proportion that belies the complexity of the logistics behind their construction. For each colonnade required not only the quarrying and shaping of granite, but the precise alignment of pillars, whose capitals bear motifs now weathered, yet still distinct. And alongside these orderly market avenues lie the remains of water channels and reservoirs, whose intricate engineering speaks to a mastery of hydraulic management central to the city's function, though the full extent of this system remains only partly understood. For while stepped tanks like the well-known Pushkaranis display flawless geometry, the conduits feeding them follow paths that vanish beneath collapsed structures or merge into natural depressions shaped by seasonal runoff, leaving parts of the network speculative and prompting ongoing investigation into how the Vijayanagara engineers balanced ritual needs with practical irrigation in a climate defined by monsoon extremes. And within the royal enclosure, where broken platforms and fragmented walls hint at administrative and ceremonial life, the subtlety of design becomes even more apparent, particularly in structures like the Mahanavami Dibba, whose layered terraces once supported courtly displays and military reviews. Yet the exact nature of many activities carried out here remains uncertain despite textual mentions in foreign travellers' accounts, which offer vivid impressions but few concrete architectural descriptions. And the Lotus Mahal, with its gently curving arches and recessed chambers, adds another dimension, for its hybrid style suggests influences from multiple architectural traditions. Yet, without inscriptions specifying its purpose, interpretations range from royal retreat to council chamber, each plausible but none definitive. And dispersed across the landscape are the monolithic sculptures, such as the immense Narasimha and the Ganesha figures, whose scale and placement prompt questions about whether they once formed part of larger architectural compositions or stood intentionally isolated to heighten their visual impact against the boulder-strewn hills. And these solitary forms, carved with precision, yet now exposed to centuries of weathering, underscore the city's practice of integrating art and terrain in ways that complicate modern attempts to reconstruct their intended spatial context. And the fortifications that ring the region introduce another layer of complexity for there. Courses follow the natural contours of the hills, incorporating boulders as ready-made bastions, and weaving through passes with an efficiency that suggests both strategic foresight and an intimate familiarity with the land, yet their sheer scale, kilometres of walls, watchtowers and gates, speaks to a defensive system whose planning required organisational capacities that remain only partly documented in surviving records, leaving gaps in our understanding of how quickly or systematically these elements were built during periods of expansion and conflict. And throughout the site, traces of everyday life merge with monumental forms. Remnants of residential quarters, granaries and workshops appear in clusters that hint at neighbourhoods defined not by rigid grids, but by the shapes of the terrain and the flows of commerce and ritual activity, creating a city whose apparent irregularity masks a deeper logic that has yet to be fully deciphered. And this sense of incomplete knowledge persists even in the best preserved areas, such as the Hazara Rama temple, with its narrative friezes depicting episodes from the Ramayana, where the density of iconography suggests a ceremonial function linked to the royal family. though its limited size relative to other temples raises questions about the specific rituals performed within its walls. And as the sun moves across Hampi's plains, casting shifting shadows across broken pavilions and silent courtyards, the landscape becomes a kind of palimpsest in which fragments of different eras coexist. Structures built at the height of imperial prosperity, alongside remains shaped by later reconstruction, erosion, or intentional dismantling during the city's fall. And these overlapping layers complicate efforts to trace a single coherent narrative of development, leaving scholars to reconcile archaeological evidence with historical texts that offer broad accounts but omit the architectural detail necessary for precise reconstruction. And in the end, Hampi's mystery arises not from any defiance of known history, but from the partial survival of a once living city whose vastness and integration with the landscape make it resistant to full comprehension. For while its monuments testify to ingenuity, administrative coordination, and artistic vision, they also bear the marks of interruption, adaptation, and loss, creating a setting where certainty and ambiguity coexist in equal measure, allowing Hampi to remain a place where the scale of human ambition is evident in every carved stone. And yet the full story of how these stones once formed a thriving capital is left to be pieced together from echoes scattered across a landscape shaped equally by craftsmanship and time. Khajuraho temples. Set across the gentle rise and fall of the Bundelkhand landscape, the Khajuraho temples emerge from groves of neem and palash trees, with a clarity of outline that belies the quietly layered uncertainties within their history. For while their soaring shikaras and intricately carved panels have long been celebrated as masterpieces of the Chandala period, the circumstances of their construction, spread across multiple generations, shaped by shifting political climates, and executed by guilds whose internal workings remain largely undocumented, form a tapestry of intention and adaptation that resists complete reconstruction, inviting a slow, observational approach to understanding how these temples came to occupy their place both physically and symbolically. And as one moves toward the western group, where the Lakshmana, Kandariya Mahadeva and Vishvanatha temples stand in a harmonious constellation, the first impression is one of near-perfect symmetry, their clustered towers rising like a petrified forest of stone peaks. Yet a closer look reveals subtle variations in proportion, base height, and decorative density that suggest different workshop traditions converging under a broad architectural grammar rather than a single unified blueprint. And this interplay between coherence and variation forms the first quiet layer of intrigue, hinting at a construction process that relied on shared principles but allowed for a degree of interpretive freedom among artisans. Freedom that can be sensed in the sculptural idioms carved along the Jangha, where bands of divine figures, guardians, musicians, dancers, and layered narrative scenes unfold with a fluidity that feels both deeply codified and expressive, though the precise criteria guiding their arrangement remain only partially understood due to the absence of detailed inscriptions describing artistic decisions or workshop hierarchies. Walking along the temple plinths, the sheer volume of sculptural detail becomes apparent, carved with such consistency that it is easy to overlook the small discontinuities, an abrupt shift in style, a motif repeated with slight modification, a panel left less refined than its neighbours. That hint at phases of work interrupted by seasonal constraints, changes in patronage, or the rotation of artisan groups within the broader guild structure. And these traces of process, though subtle, deepen the sense that the temples were products of long, complex cycles of labour rather than singular bursts of activity. A notion reinforced by archaeological evidence indicating that certain foundations were prepared long before superstructures were fully conceived, suggesting a modular approach that aligned with evolving ritual requirements and palace politics, though specific motivations remain a matter of scholarly debate. Inside the sanctums and mandapas, the spatial choreography reveals a deliberate understanding of light, movement, and acoustic resonance, with narrow corridors leading into widening halls that create a sense of transition from the outer world into concentrated sacred space. Yet the design principles that govern these transitions remain only partly documented in surviving treatises, leaving modern observers to infer connections between architectural form and ritual function through comparative analysis with other temple traditions. And within this interpretive gap, the presence of sculpted surasundaris, figures whose refinement of posture and ornamentation suggests an intentional interplay between devotion, aesthetics, and symbolic narrative, introduces another layer of ambiguity. For while their iconographic significance aligns with broader themes of fertility, prosperity, and divine presence, their prolific inclusion at Khajuraho raises questions about whether they also served specific ritual or performative functions that have since faded from collective memory. As attention shifts to the lesser visited eastern and southern groups, the range of architectural variation expands, with Jain temples displaying a different sculptural vocabulary centered on Tirthankaras, and smaller Shaivite shrines, revealing simplified plans that may reflect local patronage or later phases of Chandala influence. Yet even within these differences, the underlying structural logic remains consistent: elevated plinths, clustered shikharas, mandapas aligned along cardinal axes, suggesting that the builders maintained a core architectural ethos while adapting details to community needs, though the governing manuals or planning documents that might clarify these decisions have not survived, leaving their methodology inferred through pattern recognition and structural analysis rather than direct textual evidence. The landscape surrounding the temples also contributes to their enigmatic quality, for medieval Khajuraho was part of a broader network of settlements, reservoirs, and forested groves. Yet much of this environmental context has changed over centuries of agricultural expansion and ecological shift, obscuring pathways that once linked temples to one another through processional routes or pilgrim circuits. And these lost connections complicate efforts to reconstruct the experiential dimension of the site as it existed during Chandala rule, when the temples likely formed a ritual landscape rather than the isolated monuments they appear to be today. The decline of Khajuraho's ritual use adds another layer of quiet complexity, for historical records suggest that the region saw significant demographic and political changes after the 13th century, leading to periods of reduced maintenance and eventual overgrowth by vegetation. Yet the reasons for this decline, whether tied to shifting trade routes, military pressures, or transformations in religious patronage, remain only partially understood, as the surviving chronicles provide broad historical arcs, but little detail on how these changes affected the temples themselves, leaving archaeologists to piece together indirect evidence through patterns of structural wear, collapsed mandapas, and signs of partial restoration during later periods. Despite centuries of exposure, the temples retain a structural stability that underscores the builders' advanced understanding of load distribution, particularly in the corbelled roofs and clustered tower design. Yet even this engineering clarity introduces subtle questions, such as how the guilds determined the precise ratios that govern the vertical rhythm of the shikharas, or how they calibrated the placement of hidden bonding stones within the walls. Techniques observable today through structural surveys, but not explained in surviving texts, creating yet another meeting point between certain craftsmanship and uncertain method. And as evening settles over Khajuraho, softening the sharpness of the carvings and casting long shadows across the stepped platforms, the temples seem to embody a convergence of meticulous planning and partial forgetting, their artistry undeniably human, yet shaped by processes no longer fully visible, their inscriptions clear in intention, yet silent on technique, and within this gap between what the stones reveal and what the historical record omits. The site maintains a lingering sense of mystery, not through hints of the impossible, but through the recognition that even the most thoroughly studied monuments can carry within their structure layers of decisions, adaptations, and lost narratives that resist final interpretation, allowing Khajuraho to remain a testament to the complexity of medieval craftsmanship and the quiet endurance of unanswered questions woven into every carved surface. Meenakshi Temple. Rising from the dense urban fabric of Madurai, like a self-contained world of towers, corridors, and ritual pathways, the Meenakshi Temple presents itself with an immediacy that almost conceals the slow accretion of centuries that produced its current form. For while the complex today appears unified beneath its soaring gopurams, painted in vivid tiers of deities and guardians, the history behind this apparent coherence is one of layered construction, destruction, and renewal, shaped by dynastic changes, shifting artistic conventions, and a long continuity of worship that adapted the temple's spaces to evolving needs without leaving behind a complete architectural record. And it is this interlacing of persistence and reinvention that forms the quiet starting point of its mystery. For the underlying structure contains granite foundations and sanctums dating back to early medieval phases, while many of the towering gateways that define the contemporary skyline are products of Nyack period expansion, their colourful plaster ornamentation representing a later interpretive flourish, rather than the temple's original aesthetic. And this coexistence of divergent periods creates a spatial palimpsest where ancient stone corridors lead into mandapas, whose sculptural programs reflect very different artistic visions, making it difficult to reconstruct a single architectural narrative from the available evidence. As one moves inward from the outer courtyards, the corridors widen and narrow in unexpected rhythms, lined with hundreds of sculpted pillars, whose variety of forms suggests work by multiple guilds across different eras. And although inscriptions record the patronage of kings, queens, merchants, and administrators, they seldom describe the methods or sequences of construction, leaving modern scholars to infer relationships between stylistic phases through comparative analysis rather than explicit documentation. And within this pattern of inference, the temple's evolving footprint becomes especially intriguing for the underlying geometry. Its concentric enclosures oriented along cardinal directions implies a planned adherence to vastu principles. Yet the variations in scale, alignment and ornamentation suggest that each expansion responded to the conditions of its time, whether the urban growth of Madurai, political ambitions of the Nyack rulers, or ritual developments within the temple's own sacred calendar. And this combination of rigidity and adaptation helps explain why the complex feels simultaneously orderly and organic, as though it grew outward through a long and largely unrecorded dialogue between religious intention and practical necessity. At the heart of the temple lies the sanctum of Meenakshi and that of Sundareshwara, twin deities whose interconnected shrines reflect a theological emphasis unique to Madurai. Yet even here, the architectural sequence remains partly obscure, for while early medieval inscriptions confirm the antiquity of worship at the site, much of the current granite superstructure likely dates to later reconstructions, meaning that the forms seen today mirror a cultural memory of earlier layouts, rather than providing a direct window into their original design. And this reliance on reconstruction, though rooted in tradition, introduces subtle uncertainties into the spatial history of the complex, reinforcing the sense that the temple we see now is both ancient and reimagined. Within the famed corridors of the Thousand-Pillar Hall, whose name references not an exact count, but an impression of vast multiplicity, the sculptural detail offers another quiet enigma. The pillars bear a combination of mythological scenes, decorative motifs, and narrative carvings, whose stylistic coherence suggests a strong guiding hand. Yet their placement and thematic progression do not follow a strictly linear program, implying that aesthetic goals may have outweighed narrative sequencing, or that the hall served purposes, ritual, administrative, or ceremonial, not fully preserved in surviving records, and the hall's careful attention to acoustics, with ceilings shaped to diffuse sound evenly, further hints at uses that extended beyond static worship. Though again, explicit textual confirmation is lacking, leaving interpretation suspended between architectural evidence and contextual speculation. The temple's famed golden lotus tank introduces yet another layer of subtle complexity, for its slightly irregular shape, and the channels leading into it suggest adjustments over time, perhaps responding to changes in monsoon patterns, urban drainage, or ritual requirements. And even today, its serene surface belies a long history of hydraulic adaptation, typical of large South Indian temple complexes. Yet the absence of early engineering records means that the exact evolution of the tank must be inferred from masonry variations and sediment layers rather than direct historical testimony, making it one more element whose story is partly preserved and partly obscured. Beyond the sanctums and tanks, the towering gopurams dominate the skyline with a profusion of stucco figures repainted over generations. Their vivid colours now a defining feature of the temple, though not necessarily reflective of their earliest appearance. And this cycle of repainting complicates efforts to trace stylistic development across time, for layers of pigment obscure earlier iconographic decisions, while the underlying stone core remains largely inaccessible to detailed study. Meaning the histories embedded within these gateways, how they were planned, how many artisans worked on them, how often they were repaired, remain mostly unrecorded despite their prominence, an absence of documentation that contributes quietly to the temple's aura of historical depth. The complex also contains numerous smaller mandapas, some dedicated to festivals, others to administrative activities or ritual preparation, many of which bear architectural anomalies such as mismatched pillars, repurposed stones, or partially recarved motifs, indicating that elements from earlier structures were incorporated into later phases of construction. A common practice in regions with long temple building traditions, but one that creates interpretive challenges. For each reused fragment introduces questions about its origin, its original meaning, and the circumstances that led to its incorporation into a new spatial context, all of which remain matters of carefully framed conjecture rather than certainty. Even the broader urban setting of the temple adds to its enigmatic character. For medieval Madurai, developed in concentric rings around Meenakshi's sanctum, its streets aligned with the temple's cardinal pathways in a manner that suggests deliberate urban planning. Yet the precise mechanisms of this planning, the administrative structures, land grants, and construction protocols, are recorded only indirectly through inscriptions referencing donations and festivals, leaving much of the city's integrative design to be inferred through archaeology, spatial analysis, and comparisons with other temple-centered urban formations in South India. And as evening falls over the temple, softening the colours of the gopurams and drawing shadowed gradients across the granite floors, the complex begins to reveal the continuity that ties its disparate elements together. Centuries of uninterrupted ritual, layered spaces that retain meaning even as their original functions grow dim, and architectural decisions whose full rationale may remain forever beyond recovery, yet remain grounded in human craftsmanship and evolving tradition rather than inexplicable mystery. And it is within this blending of certainty and ambiguity, where inscriptions illuminate some aspects while others remain silent, where architectural clarity coexists with historical gaps, that the Meenakshi temple holds its enduring sense of quiet wonder. A place whose mystery arises not from anything improbable, but from the richness of a living monument shaped across many generations, each leaving traces that both illuminate and obscure the story contained within its walls. Rani Ki Vav. Set within the quiet riverine landscape of Patan, where the Saraswati once flowed with greater certainty than it does today, Rani Ki Vav descends into the earth with a depth and intricacy that reveal themselves slowly, step by measured step, as though the structure were designed not only to store water, but to guide the observer through a gradual transition from the brightness of the surface world into the sculpted, symbolic realm below. And this descent becomes the first hint of its quiet enigma. For while stepwells across Western India share a common architectural purpose, the ambition and refinement embodied here suggest a project shaped by more than practical need. Yet the surviving inscriptions offer only fragments, names of patrons, dates of construction and restoration, without detailing the methods, workforce dynamics, or ritual intentions that guided its creation in the 11th century, leaving scholars to reconstruct its story from the precision of its geometry and the dense sculptural program that lines its terraces, pillars, and landings, with narratives that seem almost too elaborate for a utilitarian structure. And as one begins the descent, the stepwell widens into a multi-tiered corridor flanked by colonnades, each level adorned with hundreds of carefully carved figures, avatars, celestial beings, guardians, and mythological episodes rendered with a clarity that has survived centuries underground. Yet, despite the richness of this iconography, the logic behind its arrangement remains partly obscured. For while certain patterns align with well-known cosmological and devotional motifs, others appear at unexpected intervals or in atypical groupings, suggesting a program shaped by artistic interpretation or evolving ritual concepts rather than single standardized plan. And this variability introduces subtle questions about how the sculptor guilds coordinated such extensive work within a subterranean space where natural light and airflow were limited, especially given the depth of the structure and the need to carve precise reliefs in confined conditions, challenges for which no contemporary building manuals survive to provide technical explanation. At the lower levels, the sandstone pillars reveal faint tool marks that indicate stages of finishing, with some surfaces polished to near smoothness, while others retain traces of earlier chiselling, hinting at phases of work interrupted by seasonal constraints or shifting political circumstances. Interruptions also suggested by the presence of partially carved motifs that appear to have been abandoned mid-process, though whether due to resource shortages, environmental disruptions, or changes in patronage remains uncertain. And these subtle discontinuities coexist with the extraordinary precision of the stepwell's geometry, where the alignment of steps, corridors, and carved panels adheres to ratios so consistent that even after centuries of silt burial and later restoration, the structure retains a harmony recognizable across its surviving sections, a harmony that points toward a sophisticated architectural understanding that must have guided its construction but left few textual traces, creating the quiet tension between evident mastery and undocumented method that shapes the site's atmosphere. The stepwell's inverted temple concept, where the descent mimics a symbolic journey towards sanctity, becomes more apparent as one reaches the lowest surviving stages, where a once functional well shaft would have mirrored the surface sky in its water, transforming the deepest point into a locus of both practical and symbolic significance. Yet the original mechanisms for water management, including the channels and filtration methods that likely supplemented seasonal inflow, have been obscured by centuries of sediment buildup and the collapse of certain structural elements during the long period in which the stepwell lay buried, meaning that the hydraulic engineering of Rani Ki Vav remains only partially deciphered, inferred through comparisons with other regional stepwells, whose water systems survive more intact. And this interplay of inferred function and preserved form underscores the stepwell's dual identity. For while its primary role was to serve as a reservoir, its elaborate sculptural program suggests layers of meaning that extend beyond utility into ritual, cosmology, and royal patronage, particularly given its association with Queen Udayamati and the dynastic memory it was likely intended to reinforce. When the stepwell was rediscovered in the 20th century, after centuries of silt burial, the process revealed another layer of mystery: the remarkable preservation of many sculptures, that had remained shielded from weathering by the very soil that concealed them. Yet this preservation also complicates efforts to reconstruct the structure's original appearance, for some sections survived in near-pristine condition, while others were eroded, displaced, or collapsed before burial occurred, creating an uneven archaeological record that leaves certain questions, such as the precise extent of the original pavilion structures, or the exact arrangement of the uppermost sculptural friezes, open to interpretation based on limited fragments, structural logic, and parallels in other Solanki-era architecture. The depth and linear progression of the stepwell also contribute to its enigmatic character, for the long visual axis from the surface entrance to the well shaft creates a perspective system that must have been carefully planned, yet without surviving construction records, scholars debate whether the builders worked from the top downward, carving and constructing progressively deeper levels, or employed a more complex sequence that allowed for simultaneous work at multiple tiers, a question made more difficult to answer due to the absence of clear staging marks or construction inscriptions in the surviving masonry. And this uncertainty illustrates the broader challenge of interpreting ancient construction practices, when physical evidence outlasts documentary testimony, leaving the technical history of even the most impressive structures partially veiled. The iconography across the terraces adds yet another dimension, for while many figures adhere to established symbolic roles, Dashavatara panels, apsaras, nagas, and protective deities, other motifs blend narrative and decorative elements in ways that challenge straightforward classification, suggesting either a localized sculptural tradition or an integration of multiple workshop influences. Though without signed panels or guild records, the identities and regional backgrounds of the artisans remain unknown, leaving their stylistic fingerprints as the only remaining clues to a complex artistic ecosystem. Even the stepwell's relationship to its surrounding landscape invites reflection, for the Saraswati River that once fed it has shifted course over the centuries, altering the environmental context in ways that obscure how the stepwell originally interacted with the hydrology of the region. And while geological studies offer partial insights, the changing river patterns make it difficult to determine precisely how often the stepwell held water, how deep the water typically reached, or how the structure functioned during periods of drought. All practical factors that would have shaped its ritual and social role during its active life. As sunlight moves across the terraces, illuminating some carvings while leaving others in shadow, the stepwell reveals the interplay of designed space and natural light that must have influenced its visual experience. Yet the original lighting conditions, likely shaped by the seasonal angle of the sun, the presence of reflective water, and the use of oil lamps during rituals, cannot be fully reconstructed, adding another layer of interpretive distance to the site. And in the gentle silence of its descent, Rani Ki Vav holds an atmosphere of layered human intention and partial historical obscurity, offering clarity through its craftsmanship, yet leaving open the deeper story of how its builders coordinated such an ambitious project, how its symbolism aligned with lived ritual practice, and how its varied elements once functioned together in a landscape shaped by shifting water and changing time, allowing the stepwell to retain a quiet, grounded mystery rooted not in impossibility, but in the limits of what the surviving record can reveal. Elephanta Caves, set within the basalt heart of Garapuri Island, where tidal channels carve slow pathways through mangroves before rising toward the rugged slopes. The Elephanta Caves introduce themselves with a restrained simplicity that only gradually reveals the depth of intention beneath their weathered surfaces. For the rock-cut pillars and shadowed chambers at first seem almost modest compared to grander mainland temples. Yet as one steps into the central cave and the dim outline of the three-faced Maheshmurti begins to emerge from the stone, a quieter, more introspective mystery takes shape. Rooted not in the improbable, but in the complex interplay of geology, craftsmanship, and historical silence that surrounds these 6th to 7th century monuments. And from the outset, the caves hint at uncertainties through their very incompleteness. Unfinished pillars, partially carved panels, abrupt transitions between refined reliefs and rough quarry surfaces, suggesting phases of excavation halted or redirected by circumstances not fully recorded, while surviving inscriptions remain too sparse to trace a precise lineage of patronage, leaving scholars to rely on stylistic comparisons and political context to link the caves to early Kalachuri or late Gupta influence, though no attribution holds absolute certainty. And this absence of definitive identification becomes the first quiet thread in Elephanta's layered enigma. The main cave's layout, with its expansive mandapa supported by rows of massive pillars, reflects a deliberate architectural rhythm that balances open space with sculptural density. Yet the decision to carve such a large chamber into a hill of relatively hard basalt, especially at a location that required transporting artisans, tools, and provisions across water, invites questions about the practical and symbolic motivations guiding its placement. For while the island's central ridge offered structural stability, it also imposed challenges of ventilation and lighting that must have influenced the carving process. Though the methods used to manage dust, coordinate multiple sculpting teams, and maintain spatial accuracy remain undocumented, surviving only in the rock's faint tool marks and the subtle irregularities that appear in certain pillars whose profiles differ slightly from their neighbours. At the heart of the cave, the monumental Maheshmurti, its serene, towering presence emerging from a continuous basalt wall, anchors the entire complex with an authority that transcends its partially damaged state. And its triadic representation of creation, preservation, and destruction has long been recognized as a sculptural achievement of exceptional refinement. Yet the choices behind its placement and proportions remain less clear. For the figure is not centered within the cave, but positioned to align with a spatial axis that seems to interact with natural light entering through the eastern portico, suggesting an intentional relationship between illumination and the sculpture's shifting expressions throughout the day, though the degree to which this alignment was planned or fortuitous remains open to interpretation given the absence of contemporary descriptions of the cave's ritual use. And the surrounding reliefs, Ravananugraha, Gangadhara, the Ardhanarishvara panel, and the marriage of Shiva and Parvati, form a coherent iconographic program that likely reflected doctrinal concerns of early Shaivism. Yet subtle variations in carving depth, stylistic detail, and finishing technique imply that different workshops or generations of artisans contributed to the panels, introducing slight discontinuities that complicate efforts to view the program as the execution of a single unified plan. Moving through the subsidiary caves, the scale diminishes, but the sense of partial completion increases, with some shrines containing lingams housed within simple, undecorated chambers, while others bear traces of abandoned sculptural outlines, suggesting either shifts in patronage or disruptions in the labour force. Disruptions that might align with known historical conflicts in the region, but cannot be directly linked without more substantial records. And these unfinished surfaces, though silent in themselves, become subtle markers of historical interruption, reinforcing the notion that the island's rock-cut complex developed across a fluid period of political and religious change, rather than unfolding as a single, uninterrupted project. The geology of the island adds another layer of complexity, for the basalt here varies in grain and fracture pattern, influencing both the quality of carving and the long-term preservation of details, and the weathering visible today, especially along the cave entrances exposed to sea winds, complicates efforts to determine which erosions reflect age and which indicate choices made by the artisans in response to the stone's natural properties. And the challenges posed by this geology raise questions about the tools and techniques employed in the excavation, such as how artisans coordinated the removal of large volumes of rock while maintaining the integrity of ceilings and pillars, or how they managed microfractures that could have threatened structural stability. Questions made more intriguing by the absence of preserved scaffolding holes or construction debris that might clarify their methods. The strategic location of Elephanta within the harbour, approaches of ancient Mumbai, also invites consideration of its broader cultural role. For while the caves are clearly dedicated to Shaivite worship, their placement on an island frequently visited by seafarers suggests that they may have served as both a ritual centre and a landmark within regional maritime networks, though the lack of early textual references makes it difficult to determine whether Elephanta was a major pilgrimage site, a royal project, or a more localized expression of devotion. And this ambiguity persists even when examining later periods, as the island underwent phases of neglect, repurposing, and limited occupation that further obscured the original context of the caves. The later arrival of foreign powers, particularly the Portuguese, left additional marks, both literal and historical, on the site, including documented instances of damage and repurposing that altered certain sculptures and architectural elements. Yet even these disruptions form part of the stepwise transformation that makes the caves difficult to interpret with absolute clarity, for the cumulative effects of human action and natural decay have blurred the boundaries between the original aesthetic and subsequent interventions, leaving modern restoration efforts to balance preservation with an awareness of the interpretive gaps that cannot be fully bridged. As daylight fades within the main chamber, and the contours of the Maheshmurti merge with the surrounding shadow, the cave's atmosphere crystallizes into a sense of depth, not tied to scale alone, but to the layers of intention, interruption, and partial survival embedded within its stone. For Elephanta stands as a place where technical skill and historical silence coexist, where the grandeur of early medieval sculpture is matched by the quiet uncertainty of its origins and methods, and where the absence of full documentation leaves room not for fantasies but for carefully grounded inquiry, allowing the caves to maintain a gentle, persistent mystery rooted in the limits of what the surviving evidence can reveal, and in the lasting imprint of human craftsmanship, shaped within a landscape of shifting tides and enduring stone.